everyone. I'm Beth Noy, and I'm a designer with the Urban Design Center. I'd like to welcome you all back after a very long break. Just to kind of give you an update, we had a bunch of UDC talks that were canceled for various reasons. So we are resuming today with Fred Belledin, and he'll be talking about our warehouse district. And if you were here expecting the Stone's Warehouse, I'm sorry, that will not be discussed. Hopefully in the future, when the project's a little bit more advanced, we will have a UDC talk that will talk about Stone's Warehouse. But today, we'll resume our lecture series with Fred. He is from Clearscapes, and he'll be discussing Incidental Beauty, integrating industrial districts into our cities. Fred is a principal with Clearscapes architecture firm. Clearscapes has been a Raleigh hallmark of excellence in art, design, and preservation for almost 35 years. In that time, they have acquired 70 design awards for their effort. The firm has a large, comprehensive, and impressive portfolio of projects that range in type and scale. Their work includes the Contemporary Art Museum of Raleigh, Marbles Museum, Raleigh Convention Center, and the soon-to-be-constructed Raleigh Union Station. The first phase will break ground on May 8th. Fred's focus is on urban adaptive use and infill projects through which he seeks to help preserve the craft-based traditions of North Carolina and contribute to the evolution of enduring and desirable urban environments. Thank you, Fred.
Architecture, despite what architects like to think, is not an unalloyed good. As architects, we know that each place we touch will be changed forever, and with any change, there is something to be gained and something to be lost. The opportunity to make better places without losing the best qualities of what make them unique, to me, is the privilege and responsibility of being an architect. And I think this is particularly important with the types of buildings that we're discussing. In most of these cases, when we work on industrial districts and industrial buildings, we're altering at a fundamental level what these places are, their purpose for being. And doing this with an intention in a way that we intermingle the new use and the former life to the betterment of both is what we strive for as a firm when we work on these types of projects. In the time we have today, I'm going to share a couple of projects that we've worked on as a group and talk a little bit about at least one of our industrial districts in the city of Raleigh, the warehouse district. And a quick note before we get started, Clearscapes is a studio. By that I mean we work collectively as a group. We share in the design, we share in all of the work it takes to make a design the reality. So anything that you see today, whether it's something you appreciate or not, the credit or the blame goes to all of us, many of us sitting in the room here today. SAXAPAHAW is an unincorporated mill village located on the banks of the Haw River west of Chapel Hill. The village began life as a SAXAPAHAW cotton factory in about the 1840s. It grew rapidly into a collection of multiple industrial buildings surrounded by hundreds of mill homes. Today, SAXAPAHAW is a very different place. As the populace of Chapel Hill and Carborough continue to move west in search of less tamed parts of the state, it's grown into a collection of a lot of individual people, a lot of artistic people who are seeking an environment very different than what you're finding in most of the Triangle. What you're seeing here, every Saturday, for instance, they get together as a village and they throw a big party. It's called Saturdays in SAXAPAHAW. They bring in bands, they bring in food trucks, they bring in a farmer's market. Everybody gathers on a hill overlooking the mill, and they all have a good time. It's grown into quite an event, and they attract thousands of people. When the owners of the mill village first came to us, it was with really an extraordinary mission. They had visions of individual components, but unlike most clients who come with a particular program in mind, what they came with was asking us to help them create a village. In other words, they wanted to turn the history of this place on its head. The village of SAXAPAHAW historically had not a great relationship with the environment. There are stories of how the river ran red or purple or black with the color of the dye that was being used in the textile mill that day. And with the new population and new energy, they wanted to bring a life back to the village that was more in tune with the people that they have there today. So to start the process, we spent a lot of time talking. It was an incredibly diverse group comprised of a son of the former mill owner, a basketball player for University of North Carolina, a social activist, a butcher, a baker, a steel company executive, and a runner. So about as broad-based as you can get. And for their program, they wanted to bring life back to these buildings in a way that really honored and appreciated what these buildings were. What you're looking at here, there had been a project done in the early 90s in the your upper left corner, what's known as the lower mill, which was converted into affordable housing. And what we really focused on is the upper mill, the areas you see in red and yellow. I'm going to talk about a couple of these pieces briefly. First being the Haw River Ballroom. When we started on the project, this was the commercial portion of the upper mill. The Haw River Ballroom is the area, the blank wall shown to your right, and this is that elevation. And part of why I'm starting with this project as an example, we have no shortage of buildings like this in Raleigh. A lot of people consider them unattractive or at best or ugly at worst. But you need to look beyond what you see on the face of these buildings. Inside where the ballroom exists, it's comprised of 2 levels, or was comprised of 2 levels. There was a lower dark level, low ceiling, not a lot of access, and an upper level that had a little more potential. In this space, the basketball player and the social activist wanted to create a ballroom, a space where the community could gather for events, where you could bring people in from outside the community to experience the magic of SAXAPAHAW. It's important to understand is they had visions of an 800-person audience, which is basically more than the population of SAXAPAHAW as it stands today. So here in a town 20 miles west of Chapel Hill, we're going to create a ballroom, bring in live music acts from across the country, and somehow attract people in greater numbers than presently live in the village. So to do that, we knew we had to do it to a high level of fit and finish, to a high level of performance. And working with the existing building, with all existing buildings, one of the challenges is maximizing what we have to work with while overcoming or compensating for some of the shortcomings. If you look at these photos, what you'll notice, the proportions are not great for an entertainment space. The upper floor is double height, but it's still too thin and too long. We spent a lot of time working with them to understand how we could fit this program into the space, respecting the bones of the building, but more importantly, overlaying what was important to them as a community. The initial concept actually grew out of their Saturdays in SAXAPAHAW, where we gather a lot of people on the hills, or they gather a lot of people on the hills to listen to music and eat good food together. The lower floor was not in great shape structurally based on the textile use of the building, and it would have been fairly expensive to retrofit. So instead, we were able to convince them to actually tear out the lower floor, give up leasable square footage to open up the volume of the space. And what you're looking at here is introduction of a couple of mezzanines on the outside wall, which basically recreate the experience of the hill in SAXAPAHAW. At the same time, we had to look at how the space was configured for performances to make sure that we could hit all the acoustic measures and make sure that the place had good sound. So we had various studies looking at where the stage wall needed to be, how we needed to shorten the aspect ratio of the space for proper acoustics, how we needed to deal with sound control. Early renderings to help them understand what the place could be. For them, these buildings were perfect as they were. They didn't want to change anything, which is rare for a client. If we could have left everything unfinished, unpainted, exactly as it was, that would have been the approach they chose. So a lot of what we had to look at was how do we introduce the acoustic control? How do we introduce the lighting? How do we introduce some of these things where we don't obscure or bury the bones of this building? These are a couple of the early renderings, just testing the space. And at the same time, we also had to look at the entry sequence and the procession into it. There are a number of elements in the property that they all love, ranging from relics of the spinning process, to some of the old industrial offices that are fit into the buildings. So we started looking at ways that how we could repurpose and incorporate all of these pieces into the project as a whole. So what you're looking at here is an early study for an entry sequence into the building, reusing the components of the office walls as cladding for the bathrooms, and then taking the red rectangle in the lower left corner, which was basically the last place before the dyed water used to run into the river, and turning it into an art piece where we could honor the new vision of SAXAPAHAW. A couple construction photos that occurred during the process. And this is massive amounts of work working in these buildings. This is an entire concrete floor structure that's already failing structurally that needs to be removed with great care to not damage anybody or the building. Early images of it coming back. With most of it removed, you can see here that we've got better volume for an entertainment space. but it's still too long. Here we have an image of starting to introduce some of the mezzanines into the space to start to cut the aspect ratio down, and then the view back where you can see that we've got a better proportion. We had to do a lot of work on the outside. This started out, as you recall, as that blank wall. We had to introduce light. We have only one end to work with, so we introduced a large glass wall. This is Will Alphen Design Build was also part of the project team for this. And I remember this conversation because the two large beams you see in the foreground are actually balcony beams that go on the building to the left. And at this point we were discussing what would happen if the building collapsed when we were trying to insert those beams into those tiny piers that we have left. Fortunately, the building didn't collapse, and what we ended up with today is kind of a crazy industrial configuration of occupiable spaces that enliven the entry to the ballroom and serve as public space for the village as a whole. A couple images here. As I talked about earlier, their goal was really to leave everything in its rough post-industrial state. So the image to the left is landscaping. It's typical for the project. One of the things we did, we collect all the water off the building, and everything runs down a runnel on the side of the building, splashes and cascades out over a series of falls and rainwater gardens, and ultimately makes its way to the river after it's been cleansed. The image to your right is one of the old dye tanks. This is where they used to dye the socks that then ran into the river. This was a couple hours with a mag drill and a big drill bit to create a sign, which has since become the icon for the ballroom, and it's used for most of their images for the village of SAXAPAHAW as well. Another image of the building. This is the corner. What you're looking at here, the lower level currently is Haw River Farmhouse Ales. The upper level is the Eddy Pub. Further back off the screen, they actually have a butchery in place now. So what they've created is both a resource for the locals and a destination for the broader Triangle area. Inside, this is the space cleaned up and transformed into the Haw River Ballroom. As you can see, the walls, the ceiling, the structure, everything is left very simple, very unadorned. In this case, this was a raw industrial building and a little cold. They wanted to warm the space up. So very simple moves, the introduction of a wood floor does an incredible amount to change the feel of the space. It also does an incredible amount to deal with the acoustics. We were able to introduce a resilient floor, a poor man's version of a resilient floor. So they actually have ballroom dances and parties in here with great comfort. Another view inside during the day, working with some of the existing skylights we have, and all of the relics and bits and pieces of the building in place. And then obviously in use as a concert, where their shows regularly draw, as I said, 800 people, which exceeds the population of the village of SAXAPAHAW. And a lot of this project was about allowing the individual personalities to make the place their own. When you bring the diverse background together that we had around the common goal of building a village and honoring the buildings that they have to work with, they each introduce in their own way what's important to them. For Heather, the social activist who now runs the ballroom, was a lot of the old farmhouse chic and farmhouse antiques. So what we try to do is set up a strong enough infrastructure, a strong enough language in each of these projects that we create continuity across the complex, but we allow space, allow room for people to make them their own. And then with the ballroom, we looked at all of the surrounding opportunities. This is a view from what's currently the upper level of the ballroom looking out. And what you're looking at here is the old coal pit. Most of this site was built on a gradual slope down to the river. Most of it was filled. So we have areas where we have 30 feet deep of fill on this project. Incredibly difficult to deal with from a foundation standpoint. So you're putting a lot of effort into dealing with the geotechnical aspects, but with the few dollars you've got left over, you want to make a compelling space. So something even this simple, and this is a view from inside the ballroom, you understand how important it is. This is the upper level balcony inside the ballroom. You can just see that coal pit down to the left, and even beyond you can see a view out to the Haw River. So leaving it its current state, not an option. So what we were able to do was come back and with a little bit, well, more than a little bit of concrete, introduce some simple walls and create a simple space that dovetails with what they're trying to do with the Haw River Ballroom. So with one building and its associated coal pit, what we've created is a facility that works in concert with their hill. They'll have events out here where you can come out on any weekend. They'll have bands up on the hill, which is off screen to the north. They'll have bands in the ballroom, and they'll have bands out on the amphitheater stage as well. So it's a very convivial and community spirit. Other areas we played with, that earlier rendering I showed you. We ran out of money and couldn't do the art installation, but we could afford a couple of color changing LEDs. So now at least when children and parents walk into the building, they walk across the very same spot that used to stain the river with the dye with color changing LEDs and have that memory or that recollection of what this place used to be. And then lastly, as I showed you earlier, the sign. This is one of Heather's photos. I love this photo. It tells a lot about how they see the project, and it's really become an icon for the community. A second piece of the project that we'll talk about a little bit is the residential component. And originally, this residential area consumed all of this as one monstrous built environment. It was simply added onto over the years. The construction types varied tremendously, everything from timber frame in the 30s and 40s up to steel in the 50s and 60s. And the building footprint was way too large, way too deep to be able to create good residential space with. So a lot of this was about judiciously editing out. We had to find a way to introduce daylight, find a way to create the correct floor plates that we could work with from a residential component. So ultimately what we ended up doing was carving out a courtyard between the two buildings and creating two separate interconnected buildings. This is what the area looked like when we started. You can see the building in the background, which we call the North Residential Building. It was a little earlier vintage, a little more solid construction. That was timber on the lower level, steel up top. And then this building out here, the South Building, was built literally on 30 to 40 feet of compacted or poorly compacted fill. Over time, the roof had failed. You can see a little bit even here. It had sagged to the point where some of the timbers and columns had settled more than 2 feet. And again, working with this client group, their goal was not to be showy. Their goal was to honor the buildings. So we put a tremendous amount of effort into really working with the shells and finding ways that we could introduce abundant amounts of controlled daylight, but do it in a way that it was still about the overall form of the buildings and we weren't overpowering with the new. This is how the shell turned out. This is the South Building that you're looking at here with a tremendous amount of new openings on the west or the narrow side, the existing canopy in place, and then the new canopy introduced on the south side overlooking the river. And around the buildings, we spent a tremendous amount of effort sculpting and designing the spaces. These buildings are not very far apart. They're about 40 feet apart, and everybody is competing for the views of the river. So there was a lot of effort put into studying just how much space we needed to create with the courtyard to provide a compelling public or gathering space, but also provide an appropriate amount of separation and open up enough to create as many views as we could. This is part of the studies for views of different spots down to the river and the spacing between the buildings. More early studies of river views. And apologize, I don't have great photos. We haven't photographed this project yet, but these are some of the in-progress photos of the courtyard as it stands today. These are some of the images of the private balconies that look out into the courtyard. And I'll walk you quickly through the couple unit types because a lot of what we find in industrial buildings is you may come in with a preconception, but what we're trying to do is find a way to work with the building and not against the building. And in a project like this, a lot of it comes down to the finishes that people want to preserve. They want to maintain the timber beams, the timber decking, the steel structure where it exists. But part of the challenge with that is when you're trying to create living spaces for people, you're creating some of the most personal spaces out there. Acoustics are important, sound isolation is important, and it's very difficult to preserve everything that people love about these spaces, but do it in a way that's responsible and provides an appropriate living condition. So with this building, what we ended up doing ultimately was actually cutting it vertically. In other words, where the north building started out as a 2-story building with a double height 3rd floor, 4 floors in general, If we had created 4 single floors, we would have created 4 floor plates where we had to separate sound between people living there in a building where they wanted to expose all of the existing conditions. It's not workable. So at the end of the day, what we ended up doing was splitting it into 2 two-story units. We were able to combine the 2 lower floors, and we were able to introduce a mezzanine in the upper floor. What that did for us is ultimately we had only 1 acoustic separation that we had to deal with. And even though we gave up some space for the double height lower level, what we gained was increased daylight penetration, and we saved on a quarter. So at the end of the day, the square footage netted out. So same amount of square footage reconfigured within the box in a reasonable way. This is the north building. These are your quintessential lofts, simple living space with bedroom behind. The lower level units all have private entries off the courtyard with a deep living space, kitchen, and loft. The upper units all have balconies. This is the lower level unit working with what we had, timber frame structure, concrete floors. Here what you'll notice, a lot of it is what you don't see. In other words, there's a tendency working with industrial buildings to fill them up with conduit and industrial fixtures and everything else. And while that may be true of what they were like as factories, it's not really true about what people enjoy and appreciate about these spaces. So for us, while these units are very simple, it's about editing out. So things that you won't necessarily see, if you look at the kitchen bulkhead up above, all of the plumbing, all of the sprinkler distribution, all of the HVAC for the entire unit is fit into that one bulkhead. So what you're not seeing is conduit running around ceilings and walls. You're not seeing stuff drop down because we're able to condense and edit out. And what that allows you to do is focus on the elements that remain, the timber structure, the introduction of the steel and the concrete floor. Another view from the kitchen area looking out. Another view, split view, the kitchen to the left, and there was both an enclosed bedroom and an open loft option for these units. This is an open loft. And then these are views of the upper units. So here you're coming in off a corridor in the back, but we have large windows and a balcony overlooking the river on the back side. These units, as you'll see, are very different. The lower level was much woodier. Most of the guys I know tend to like the lower level units. Most of the girls I know tend to like the upper level units. They're open, more airy. Bedroom up above, this was another important thing. This north building butts directly up to the Haw River Ballroom, which is a live music venue. Neither side wanted to give up the brick wall. Neither side wanted to give up their structure. So again, we've got to find compromises and find ways to work with these buildings. In this case, what we did is split the structure at the roof by introducing a long clerestory. A lot of the sound travels up where you don't have the mass and wants to travel through that structure. By breaking it with the clerestory, we break that diaphragm and help control the sound transfer between the ballroom and the units. That being said, it's far from a perfect system. We still have structure engaging in a masonry wall. We're still getting vibration transfer, or knew we would get vibration transfer through between the 2 spaces. So going in, how they sold these units, how they worked with the buyers was something that was equally important. They were upfront about what you were buying, that the quality of these spaces, the existing finishes, the existing materials are a trade-off if we're dealing with some of those things. So the genius marketing move in this case, anyone who buys one of these units has 2 tickets for life to every music event that occurs in the Haw River Ballroom. No complaints whatsoever. South building, very different. The north building were the more affordable units. They were smaller, more compact, 1,200 square feet or so. The south building with the river views and the daylight on both sides was about attracting a different crowd. These are through units. By splitting the building and creating the courtyard, we have very long, deep units, but we were able to create daylight on both sides. A river view with a terrace to the south, and then the courtyard to the north. These units aren't yet constructed, so we'll have to live with our renderings for the time being. These are a couple views. So here, as you can see, looking out towards the river, all of that former wood elevation that was rotted out and falling apart has been removed and replaced with a glazed window wall. And all of the structure has been reinforced through here, replaced. And similar to the north building, we combined the 2 lower levels on this building to create or to minimize the amount of sound isolation membranes we had to deal with. So these are the lower level units looking out, and don't think I have an upper level view. This is a view looking back in. And then finally, With the public spaces, we wanted to make sure that they're commensurate with the quality of the units. So again, a lot of it was about not gussying things up. This is the main entry point that connects the two buildings. As you can see, everything's stripped down, kept simple, even to the water fountain that no longer works, that they didn't want to fix because the joke became it hadn't worked in so long. Moving on, this is an entirely different project. This is the brew house. This is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This project in its former life was the Duquesne Brewery. Duquesne Brewery was incorporated in, I think, 1898, and by 1950 was one of the 10 largest breweries in the United States. For 3 generations, Pittsburghers left their homes on the south side slopes and trudged down the hill to the south side flats. The lucky ones probably stopped here to work. Most of them continued on down towards the Monongahela River, down towards downtown, and worked at one of many steel mills that were prevalent during the day. These are all gone. This is Southside Works, which is actually about 2 blocks up from the brew house. And the river at the time was lined with these. The joke in Pittsburgh was that anyone who was a white-collar worker took 2 white shirts to work every day because you had to change at lunchtime. It speaks to the degree of smog and smoke and what the community was like in this area. When they finished their shift, all those same workers trudged back up the hill from the mill, but not without stopping first for a beer. One of hundreds of local bars, most of them serving Duquesne beer. So this building has been an institution in Pittsburgh since 1898. The brewery ceased operations in 1972. By the early to mid 80s, there were local artists squatting in it. 120,000 square foot building, completely abandoned. By 1991, they had incorporated or organized to some extent, as much as artists are wont to do, and actually were able to convince the city of Pittsburgh to sell them the building for a song. So here we have an artist group, a bunch of artists started out as squatters, now own 120,000 square foot former industrial building. This is what the brew house looks like today. This is the old engine house, what you would expect to find a lot of typical large, open, unencumbered spaces. This is a typical bay up in the brewery. You know, over the years, the artists have on their own subdivided and created living spaces and working spaces within this building, so you're seeing some drywall, but this is typical character of the space. Inevitably, you get some of the crazy spaces that you only find in industrial settings. This is the Being John Malkovich room. Some sort of mechanical room, not sure how they used it. You literally have to crawl between the 2 beams to get from bay to bay. At most, the ceiling height is about 7 feet between the beams. Another area of the building, this is the former stockhouse area. So fully half the building was insulated warehouse storage. Heavily corked walls, they've all fallen off in these cases. And rows after rows of tanks, hundreds of thousands of gallons worth of beer. This area has been leaking probably since the 1980s. They call it the dead zone. Hasn't been occupied since the brewery ceased operations in 1972. Even worse than the dead zone is the old boiler house. This is the power plant for the facility. This has been abandoned since the brewery ceased operations. This one is literally collapsing in on itself. The roof is unsafe to walk on, and you can't really even get into the boiler house because of all the equipment that's collapsed on top of it. Courtyard behind the boiler house. And yet somehow in this environment, these artists have taken it and made it their own. The building is filled with art. Everything from painted doors, painted walls, sculptures they've created and placed all over the place. They've carved out spaces that nobody else wanted. This is a rooftop deck, which is actually next to an ammonia brine tank. Probably not the best place to be, but nevertheless, this is their barbecue pit. So, as this building is falling apart around them, they've created a place, they've seen beauty in a building that nobody wanted at the time. They had a great run for 20, 25 years. As the Brew House Association, they're still around, but they've reached the point that they literally cannot take care of the building anymore. The organization is in danger of failing, the building is in danger of failing. So they were smart enough to reach out for help. They were able to find a local developer in Pittsburgh, great community-based developer, does a lot of affordable housing. The developer reached out to some friends of ours and reached out to us. So together, we're working through remaking the building and remaking the organization at the same time. And by that I mean if the SAXAPAHAW project was about finding comfort in the landscape, warming things up, creating comfort with the community, this project is about restlessness. These are artists that are terrified about losing their autonomy. They're terrified about losing the environment that they've grown up in. And this is about taking a similar industrial building that we did in SAXAPAHAW, but putting it together in a much different way. A lot of that comes down to how we can make the project function. When you have an industrial building that you're not taking care of, when you're not code compliant, you can charge people $300 a month for 3,000 square feet of studio space. It doesn't work anymore. That's going to change. So the trick is to maintain some autonomy to keep costs down. We've got to be able to fit more people in this building. So a lot of this is looking carefully at how can we configure units where we can create live-work conditions in such a way that the artists can come in, occupy these units, and manipulate them to suit their own work process. So what you're looking at here, this is a small vitrine unit. Rather than carving up and creating separate spaces, what we're trying to do is create small platforms, sliding panels, movable walls, where artists can choose to sleep up, they can choose to sleep down, they can have studios high, they can have studios low, they can basically configure it, open it, close it in a way that suits their needs. These particular units with this project are tied to visibility as well. We've got the glass walls opening into the building because the intent is to allow artists to show their work to others within the building. Another view of the same building, or sorry, same unit. And then the one-bedroom units are similar. So step one with all of this is creating a more efficient package within the same industrial shell than what they had before. Here they want to maintain the rawness, they want to maintain the edginess, they want to maintain the mutability of the spaces. So what you're looking at here, very different quality than what you looked at in SAXAPAHAW. Another view of the same unit. And then with all of our projects, we try to find ways to play. You know, this is a building that began life as a brewery, turned into an artist collaborative, and now is really turning into a mixed-use, mixed-income artistic community with both artists, non-artists, live-work conditions, dedicated workspaces, galleries. But these artists love this building. They love every stitch of it, and we want to maintain ways that they can hold on to that past. These are old beer tanks, 6 foot in diameter, roughly 80 foot long, 60,000 gallons worth of beer in each of these tanks. There's about 10 of them left in the project. The rest have already been cut up by the artists over the last 30 years and turned into artwork. So, in honor of their closing in the 1970s, this is our Logan's Run entry lobby. So we wanted to take the tanks, because it's a building for artists, and reassemble them in a way that's different than what people are used to seeing. So what this represents is essentially one of those beer tanks disassembled, reconfigured in a different way. All the parts and pieces are there, but this allows you to experience both the inside of the tank, the outside of the tank. It allows both some of the visual and, well, some of the literal and figurative weight of the history to maintain over your head, but we set it up in such a way that we shape the space. When you walk into this building, there's no doubt that you're walking into the history of this building. A couple other views of some of this, and these are early studies as well. This project's not yet built. So, with that as a background, what I'd like to talk about for the last 15 minutes or so is how some of this applies or could apply to Raleigh, or is already applying to Raleigh. So naturally, we start with an industrial map of New York City. And the reason for this is a map based on, I think it's a 1922 map, but it's based on the 1918 census for New York City. And what this is showing is at that point in time, New York City had over 32,000 factories, over 825,000 workers in industrial spaces in New York City. In 1940, 60% of New York workers were employed in industry or manufacturing. Today, that number is 16%. Now, what that means, I'm sure most everyone in this room has been to New York City. They are lousy with great old industrial buildings, and they found a lot of incredibly creative ways to reuse them. When we compare this to Raleigh, we have a very different situation. Raleigh was built as a much smaller community. It was built as a city of 50,000 people at most for years and years. We're not an industry town, we're a government town. So our industry is very limited. This is the 1792 map, William Christmas plan of Raleigh. That area that you're seeing there is what the Downtown Raleigh Alliance brands as the warehouse district. So compared to New York, we've got at most a handful of buildings to work with. This is an 1872 Dries map, same thing on the wall over there of downtown. Anybody in preservation loves this map. Same thing for reference here. You can see by the 1880s, the railroads had started moving into the southwest corner of downtown. Area known as the Boylan Y, low-lying, swampy, not a pleasant place to be, so naturally the railroads and industrial component of the city tended to settle in this area. In 1892, things started to pick up. Raleigh got its first Grand Union Station. This building is still there today, catty corner from Nash Square. And when it was laid out actually with the platforms behind it to the west. So this is a view looking towards Nash Square on the right. This is a 1918 Seaboard Airline Railway map showing how this worked. Union Station proper is the orange square. The platforms actually extended the full length of Martin Street down to west, down to the terminus at west. And this is an aerial showing that configuration. So what's particularly compelling for us when we look at this area is the amount of interconnectivity, the amount of infrastructure that existed. You've got everything from the platforms, the dedicated platforms running along Martin Street to what formerly was the Martin Street Viaduct that connected Martin Street up to the Boylan Heights neighborhood to the west. Again, for reference, station, platforms. A couple earlier views. This is Martin Street, what it used to be like back in the 19-teens and 20s. You can see the roof of the station beyond. This is a view looking west down Martin Street with some of the Dillon properties that are still present today. And this is an aerial view looking back towards downtown where you can see how all of this fit within the downtown landscape. As the railway grew, Raleigh really became a wholesale distribution hub for the Southeast. A lot of railroad-related industries settled in around the railroad, and a lot of supporting businesses settled in around the surrounding railroad. By 1929, before the stock market crashed, there were 80 rail cars a day being processed in the depot district. These are some of the businesses that by nature grew up around. This is a freight warehouse for Southern Railroad. This is the early Dillon Supply, formerly Peden Steel, located on the very western edge of town. This is a view looking back towards downtown. You can see the Martin Street. These were all plumbing warehouses and machine shops. Our office is actually over here. By this point in the 1945, you can see the Wake County Courthouse beyond. And the warehouse district as we know it on this side of town really reached its apogee about World War II, just before, just after. This is an aerial view showing the full build out, the full extent of what existed at the time. By this point, Union Station was gone. They had relocated over to where the current Amtrak station was. You can see that the Martin Street Viaduct and connection is still in place. And then you can see basically all of this at this point in time is the Dillon Warehouse Complex, also over here. And then everything down over here is the former fertilizer and oil company, cotton oil company for North Carolina. And like most places, beginning in the 60s, 70s, things trended down for downtown. This is a view from 1981. Martin Street Viaduct was removed. A couple more shots of that. That's a former Boylan Bridge in the background. I put this slide in because, as an example of my appreciation, this is the closing ceremony for the Boylan Street Bridge executed by citizens of Raleigh on November 11th, I think, 1981. And as you look around town today, think about how many buildings being built today are going to engender the same level of regret and loss when they disappear. So where does that leave us today? You know, in the last few years, the warehouse district has been undergoing a renaissance of sorts. What you're looking at here, the area in red is recognized as the Depot National Register District. That means it's got historic status from the federal government. The area you're looking at in orange is what Downtown Raleigh Alliance designates the warehouse district, so there is some overlap between the two. And in this community, this part of town that was once built by men doing work with their hands is now home to creative and intellectual types. It's occurred all across the country. It's no different here. In the last 5 or 10 years, you've started to attract a lot of artists, architects, designers into this part of town. And then what I love seeing is we're also starting to re-attract some of the makers. You've got the dairy chocolate, Crank Arm Brewing, some of the people that want to use these buildings for their intended purposes. And some of the work that's been going on, that Southern Freight Depot today, restored, home to Videri, Jose and Sons, Italian restaurant, number of different businesses. Old Brogdon's produce building, they used to chrome bumpers in the basement. Today it's the CAM, Contemporary Art Museum. Even simpler buildings. This is a little building on Davie Street. Today it's Crank Arm Brewing. Some larger projects, part of the old Dillon, the old Peden complex. Today is Citrix. That one was a pretty dramatic change. And then we've got other buildings that still exist that we still have opportunities with. This is the original Union Station for Raleigh. Still there today. It's lost some of its accoutrements, it's lost its turret, but the bones of it are still there. And then finally, some of the old Dillon properties still existing on West Street and Harrington Street. And then one of the big changes coming, and this will come back to where I would argue that architecture is not an unalloyed good, that with every change there is both positive and the potential for negative. Union Station, all in all, I think is a positive, but what it's done is started to trigger an incredible amount of speculation in this community, which is going to threaten the buildings that we have left. This is the Raleigh Union Station building as it stands today, 1960s building known as the Viaduct building because it was literally built into the viaduct structure. This is a view from the backside looking back towards downtown. And this is a view of the inside. So with this project, we have yet again a different approach from what I showed you on the earlier two. If SAXAPAHAW was about comfort and appreciation, if the brew house is about restlessness, this is really about a more dramatic transformation. And by that I mean we're taking what was a humble industrial building and we're overlaying now a civic responsibility onto it. And with that, inevitably, there will be change. We're working very hard on this project, or have worked very hard on this project, to find a balance to that change. In other words, we want to honor the industrial history of the area, we want to honor the rail history of the area, but we also want to honor the future and the hope for the future by introducing that civic element onto it. This is an overall aerial plan. What you're looking at is West and Martin. So today, this is an empty lot with a small one-story building. This is that viaduct building. This is the TTA-owned building to the north. This is the Dillon-owned building to the northeast where Kane is talking about doing the project. This is the Contemporary Art Museum, formerly Flanders Gallery and the Body Club. So with this project, what we're really trying to do is honor the past, honor the future, and do it in a way that we're stitching together the community. I talked earlier about the fact that what struck us was the amount of connectivity, the amount of infrastructure that existed in the warehouse during the heyday. And as part of that, by introducing a multimodal station, it's really incumbent upon us to find ways to reintroduce that connectivity, or at least the opportunity for that connectivity in the future. So as part of that, we want to embrace vehicles, we want to embrace trains, we want to embrace buses, we want to embrace cars, we want to embrace pedestrians and bicyclists, and we want to use this as a crossroads, as a connection for all of the southwest corner of Raleigh. So the plaza becomes a gathering place, but we want the gathering place to be able to connect. As you probably know, there are plans to extend West Street down, ultimately out towards Dick Street. There's a drop that's occurring here. That's being integrated in with this project. Even with this piece, we have a canopy/walkway, which is basically a reintroduction of the former Martin Street Viaduct in a way that in the future a pedestrian and bike bridge could be extended back across the tracks to the west. So the goal is that over time you'll be able to travel from the south to downtown Raleigh, to the west, to the north and back, using Raleigh Union Station as the nexus. A part of this is bringing a much needed public use to it. Yes, we need a train station, but a train station doesn't inspire people to gather. So as part of this project, what we've actually done is been able to fit the train station in the back corner of the building. being able to keep all the existing infrastructure, but what that does is allow us to open up the majority of the building as a civic space. So with this project, we're trying to create the next great public gathering space, both exterior on the plaza, interior in the building, for this end of town to help create an anchor. In terms of tying back into the city, the connection off of Martin Street is incredibly important. We've got the road that continues to access down, which allows you to tie directly into Fayetteville Street, but even the design of the canopy is tied into the street grid in the way that this building sits within the city. There's an offset that occurs in Martin Street. So as we develop the form of the canopy, what we were able to do is actually bifurcate it or shift it so it reinforces the street grid. So what you're looking at, Martin Street's actually over here at this point, but if you're in the building, the canopy from inside acts as a viewing lens and it reinforces the street grid. As I said earlier, we want to pull in from the past. It's important to us that this be a place, be a crossroads. This is going to be a place where history meets the future. This is going to be a place where locals meet out-of-towners. It should be a place for sharing of ideas. So the idea of the railroad diamond is something that's been integrated throughout the project as well. You'll see it in the structure. A lot of the new stuff is a zigzag. It differentiates it from the old, but what it also does is play with perspective, just like Renaissance painters used to do. You're not going to find a horizontal line. Everything moves throughout the project. Again, with some of the railroad story, back to the canopy, we wanted to reintroduce the idea of signage or signpost. The image you're looking at on the left is a semaphore, which is basically what was used in an early version of a traffic light for train conductors. The plaza, as we laid it out, has become our version of an urban semaphore. We're able to identify circulation, a branch line, so to speak, to the left, which is the access to the site. We're able to identify the main line or the public gathering space to the right. And then with that canopy, we're able to bring in some of the boldness, the heaviness of the past with a heavy cantilevered structure. But we want to do something more with the skin. By introducing the civic use, we want to go back to what makes great train stations great train stations. For that, you look back to Grand Central, which are the images on top. It's a station in Brussels to the left. This one's Germany from when they had the World Cup in 2008. And then finally, this is Chicago's terminal station during World War II. So again, ways of creating grand public spaces with art, with design. So for that, given that this is a multimodal station and not just a train station, we're trying to introduce a broader idea of travel, of mobility, of movement. So we're going back to the days of cartography and the days of old white guys with beards blowing ships across the ocean on the maps. So for us, what the canopy really becomes is our breath of gods. And by that, I mean literally and figuratively powering trains, powering boats, powering airplanes, but also powering ideas. And to create that, what we want to do is go back and pull out some of the common elements from all forms of transportation, lenses, reflectors, things like that. And at the end of the day, what we'll end up doing is reintroducing some grand vision, some grand civic space on this canopy by use of everyday common elements that are typical to what occurred in this area. And then finally, I want to leave you with this thought, because the warehouse district is at a crossroads, in my opinion. If you recall from the previous image, the red outline represents the historic depot district, the orange outline represents the branded warehouse district by Downtown Raleigh Alliance. The buildings that you're looking at in green are buildings that have been preserved to some degree or another or maintained. The buildings that you're looking at in red have active projects planned for them, which may or may not preserve those buildings. And the buildings that you see in yellow are really all that remains. So in comparison to New York, where we have 52,000 factories in the city alone, in Raleigh we have a very limited area. So for me, what's important about this area is making sure that we can move forward, making sure that we can evolve in a way that reflects the potential of our future as a city, but in a way that also reflects and respects the past. Thank you. Mm-hmm.